IRMS was founded in 2019 out of a need that we saw to bring more attention to misogynist violence and ideologies that were either not taken seriously or misunderstood, even as mass violence driven by misogynist ideology had been increasing. So we founded the Institute, and we've seen a lot of progress towards more understanding of male supremacism as a construct, which is the belief that cisgender men are superior, that they deserve dominance, that they're entitled, that involves the oppression and dominance of any others, which includes cisgender women and any trans or non-binary people. And so our work has really leaned in, especially to looking at misogyny and trans misogyny on the attacks on cis and trans women that are rolled into the construct of male supremacism and the biological essentialism at the core of it, that it requires the belief in two sexes. And so the dehumanization and erasure of anyone who doesn't fit into those boxes. And I know Florence and Blue will get more deeply into that. The other kind of element of what we do is that we mostly work around the construct of supremacist ideologies rather than extremism or radicalization or other kind of similar terms. One of the reasons for this is because we know that male supremacism, as well as cisgender supremacism and white supremacism and other forms of supremacy are really not just fringe issues. They're at the core of our society, historically and in the present day. When we look at something like misogynist violence, and we consider not just the major acts of mass violence that get a lot of media attention, but the really high disproportionate levels of violence against women, in intimate partner and interpersonal violence, and then even higher disproportionate violence towards women who are also trans or people of color, or in other ways a marginalized or vulnerable population. And so when we work within a frame like extremism, we miss things like that, the belief systems around entitlement, around the division of the sexes, around gender, sort of what they call traditional, i.e. supremacist beliefs, are the same ones shared by misogynist incels and intimate partner abuse perpetrators. And so when we neglect that, we miss really important factors around what's at the root of these kinds of supremacist beliefs and these versions of violence. And often that can feed misconceptions around things like the focus on misogynist incels, focusing on them as a group that does not have sexual or romantic relationships with women, and thinking that that's the intervention point and the thing to correct, versus recognizing that actually there's a consistent male supremacist ideology that also influences perpetrators of intimate partner violence, and that we need to see those things in tandem. And so we've seen more of an embrace of that. There was a recent Secret Service report that talked about misogyny as a spectrum, including things like domestic abuse. And when you penetrate the mainstream, like the Secret Service, you figure that you must be starting to win over sort of people's understanding of these things. And so we really want to influence how people understand things like countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism, counterterrorism, the different kind of terminologies that are used towards these groups, and bringing them back to this isn't just fringe, it's mainstream, and also to being able to follow supremacist ideologies as they appear in what is conceived of as a liberal movement or population. TERFs, primarily cisgender women, primarily cisgender white women, who espouse really virulent anti-trans ideology and attempt to strip away trans rights, are an example of this kind of cisgender supremacism. We have had lots of exposure of perpetrators of harassment and abuse within liberal or leftist movements by cisgender men in those movements, especially during the Me Too period, when people, were talking about these kinds of factors. And so by focusing then on not right-wing or radical right ideology, but on the supremacist ideology, we hope more easily make sense of what's going on within what would be categorized as a leftist movement. And of course, the fact that through history, most movements that are leftist are in some way represent supremacist or exclusionary ideas, the history of unions dominated by cisgender white men, what has been called populism through the years, lots of examples of these. So we work on supremacism, and we work also on the concept of supremacist ideology as core to authoritarianism. That authoritarianism globally, you can always see is founded on male supremacist ideologies, really strict divisions around the roles of the sexes, concepts of machismo, of masculinity. And so we bring those things in as well. And we take a global transnational perspective in doing this work, which recognizes that different countries have different versions of supremacism, of theocratic movements, of what might be their multi-party structure, and how things might shake out, especially when you're in other countries that are not the US, that don't just have a two-party system, that you look at the multi-party system and how it demonstrates supremacism in different ways, in different parties. And so looking at those kinds of things and understanding those constructs is really core to what we'll be doing in the webinar series and the trainings over the course of this year, and then building from those points, because we think of supremacist ideology as really core to society, as found in the mainstream. Our prevention points tend to be early on in educational systems and also through cultural systems. We don't focus on what can be sometimes categorized as 11th hour interventions or high cost, low yield interventions. These are interventions that happen to people who are already on the pathway to radicalization, as it's called, or are already in a supremacist movement. So working on formers, working on getting them to leave movements, working on preventing them from getting deeper into movements. A lot of what we do with our intervention points is thinking about actually if misogyny, if racism, if anti-trans ideology, if these things are on a spectrum with what's found in the mainstream, then we can have different intervention points. Our keynote talk at our recent conference, the recording for which should be available soon if you missed it, brought in speakers from GLSEN and Advocates for Youth and SECUS and Educate Us. talking about intervention points around comprehensive sexuality education, which is a space where you can counter dehumanization with humanization, where you can support empathy, where you teach consent, and other forms of trans-affirming education and other elements of education that provides an accurate and empathetic view of different peoples. We think also when we work on these kinds of things, or when we work on media representations, a focus for this year will be doing some work around drag artists and performance and how they influence culture, is thinking about those kinds of intervention points as ones that then are benefiting and intervening in society as a whole. They're also not just focused on perpetrators or people considered at risk for perpetration. Something like comprehensive sex education is geared towards everyone and resourcing the populations who also need to be resourced because they're marginalized and vulnerable, not just giving our resources to people who might be perpetrators, which has been involved in the mental health approach to interventions, for instance, and other elements of resources that really privilege a population that is typically majority cisgender straight white men who are the perpetrators of violence, who are already the most resourced population, and not thinking about queer populations of color, and other communities that really require these kinds of supports as well. And we think also that supremacist movements are actually really aware. They have the same perspective on us as to the root causes of how you get supremacism across and what can threaten it, because they have for more than half a century been attacking comprehensive sex education in different kinds of ways. First branding it as communist and trying to get rid of it altogether, then creating abstinence-only education that teaches things that violate consent, that are anti-LGBTIAP, that support gender biological essentialism. They've really focused on that for a long time. And the attacks that have accelerated in the past year on drag artists and performance, which is another way for them to conflate and attack trans people as well, are elements of recognizing that these are powerful. The attacks on libraries and librarians who have books that represent a diversity of perspectives, that they recognize how important these areas are for building empathy, for humanization, and what a really significant threat they are to supremacist and authoritarian goals. And so often liberals who defend against book bans or attacks on queer and trans populations or protect sex ed, think of it as this is something that we decided to call the culture wars. That means that it's less important rather than that culture shapes our entire society. And these are distractions that the so-called right is trying to distract us from the real issues. And yes, we should protect these spaces because we support human rights and civil rights, but we don't really think that those spaces are so important. That's the perspective that I think we get from a lot of kind of liberal democratic populations when they ask us to refocus on the real issues. And so supported by coming from our work in intersectional feminism and movement studies, IRMS really rejects that perspective on things and builds towards understanding actually they've spent so much time and money and attention on education and culture and preventing gender expressive performance, and on these kinds of issues, because they're actually really powerful and they have a long-term generational impact. And so we have, youth who have grown up in federally funded abstinence-only educational systems since the 1990s, who are among our voters, who look at somebody like Donald Trump and think that he looks just like they learned that men are, that men sexually harass, that men don't follow consent, that you just kind of have to accept that. Liz Yates did really excellent research on Tea Party women that found just this kind of understanding that, well, this is just the way the world is. And systems that have been intended to dismantle the public education system, to convince liberals that privatization is somehow a better social justice good instead of being rooted in segregationist maintenance and systems, and a way to allow theocratic encroachment in the educational system to exclude people from access. And so these kinds of elements are at the core of the work we're doing, and why, as we go into our anti-supremacist training webinar series and our other programming, we'll work on things around these kinds of root causes, about thinking with this kind of mentality, and about thinking about prevention and intervention in a way that involves broad-based community cultural interventions, and also things that simultaneously, because burnout is really real in this area, build community joy and support, that as we recognize the power of drag and queer performance and art. I personally do a cabaret here where I'm currently living in New Mexico, that was started by a burgeoning drag queen last year that's very queer, where I have talked about bisexuality and abortion on the stage right after they struck down Roe for our Pride Month cabaret, which has been really important for me in sustaining Pop Mob in Oregon. Met the Proud Boys with queer dance parties that not only pushed back the aesthetic that they wanted, but helped bring joy and support for their communities. And so these creative, innovative techniques, sex education that is positive and consent-based, and that fuels the souls of not only young youth and young people, but adults too, who could totally use it, that these things go into the core of what our work looks like. So I'm going to wrap up my opening remarks there. I really appreciate the snaps that Blue has been giving me on their screen that I can see here. I'm going to hand things over to Blue and Florence, and then in the Q&A, if anyone who's here is considering being involved with our anti-supremacist training institutes, or if you'd like to ask me about other elements of IRMS programming, like our fellow and mentee programs that are open now, I'll be available to answer and give more information about all of those things after our presentations today as well. So thank you again for all being here. And I hand things over to Blue and Florence.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. And I, again, as a fellow, just to be very transparent, IRMS is doing amazing work, and you should definitely keep up with the stuff that folks are doing. I want to start off today's discussion really thinking about what it means to grasp things at the root. And a big part of what we're discussing today is really trying to understand supremacism at the root. And drawing on the lineage of thinkers and radical intellectuals, right? Um, a big part of what it means to be radical is to grasp things at their root. And this is a way of thinking that scholars like Angela Davis, right, have described as an important way of avoiding what a lot of what Alex was talking about is about sort of 11th hour interventions, and really thinking about what kind of structural changes need to be implemented in order to see the kind of changes that we want to have in the world. So I also just want to share, because Alex did note that IRMS stuff is about a global analysis, that today's presentation, what Florence and I are talking about, is more US and North American focused in sort of what we are looking at. So I just want to be clear sort of the limits of what we're going to be talking about, okay? Mainly, what our goal is to talk about how anti-trans laws, anti-abortion laws, and quote unquote, anti-critical race theory laws, how they are all connected by underlying frames of reference, sort of key logics that permeate all three major legal pushes that we've seen happening among right-wing folks in the US. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Florence to maybe give us an idea of really the anti-trans layout, the scene, for those who, bless if you have not been following it, because it is hard to be a trans person right now and not feel a lot of despair up in here. But if you don't know about what's going down, Florence is going to get us caught up.
Yeah, so, I think, the starting point of what I want to talk about is really how do we understand attacks on trans youth care, and something that kind of Alex spoke about in terms of, how liberals see these issues as being kind of like almost superficial. And to me, that comes also with this view that really hatred towards trans people is, again, it's a distraction. It's isolated hate. It's this, like the right wing just needed a scapegoat and then decided we'll pick on trans people because attacking, it didn't work when we tried to attack same-sex marriage. I mean, now that's back on the table. But and I kind of want to push back, and I'm sure Blue too, on this idea of the scapegoat framing, this idea of like trans people as a scapegoat, because I don't think it actually captures anything that's going on. We have to ask and answer questions like, why trans people? Why now? And is it a coincidence that it's coming at the same times as a huge pushback against abortion, but also things like attempted bans on critical race theory, which are so broad as to include anything that teaches the reality of racism in the US? And I think the answer is, well, no, it's not a coincidence at all. And to kind of get a sense of that, we must first kind of understand, well, first, what is going on. And the history starts and it's going to be a very kind of like fuzzy history. I'm not going into much of the details, but if there's a starting point to be picked at the politics level, it might make sense to pick the sort of like the bathroom bills that were being pushed through legislatures about, I mean, I'm getting close to 10 years. I was thinking, so it was like 2014, 2015-ish. It's been a while, but they tried to push that, and it didn't work because it tried to portray trans youth as predators, as dangerous. And to the extent that kind of works when they're trying to attack adults, that didn't work as well for kids who are seen as innocent, especially once they started getting, poster children who were largely white, very gender conforming trans girls who really exuded that white ideal of femininity. And so that didn't work. And then the right wing kind of like took a step back and laid off a little bit of children. But then a few years ago, it really came back in full force, I think in part because through the UK got this huge moment of like anti-trans you care, with the TERF movements being very, very powerful there. And a lot of it was with US funding from and collaboration from people like the Heritage Foundation from the US. And then that was, once the Bell versus Tavistock judgment was rendered at trial level in the UK, essentially reproaching the clinic for offering gender-affirming care to youth, that really catalyzed something in the US. Despite the fact that that judgment was overturned on appeal, it really started catalyzing something in the US alongside the story of Luna Younger, who was this trans girl in Texas whose father was really vehemently opposed to her having her gender affirmed socially. And they went to court, and he really drummed up a lot of attention around it, got tweets from Donald Trump Jr. and from a bunch of US-based politicians, which led to the now infamous Texas policy of investigating affirming trans youth as a form of child abuse. And following in their tracks, there really was a proliferation of bills or legislative action or executive action that really all aims at doing the same thing, which is attacking access to gender affirming care, so medical, but also social gender affirmation as much as possible for trans youth, under the idea that it's child abuse, that it's mutilation, that it's somehow really harmful to them. And we see really the shift from the bathroom bills, where the bathroom bills really tried to portray these youths as a danger. But now they've taken this kind of vulnerable, innocent white trans youth that was presented by trans movements in response to bathroom bills and actually flipped it around, was like, but look at this vulnerable kid, they're being harmed and groomed by trans adults. And that's where the spin started actually really taking hold and kind of really working. And a moment that really helped click what was happening in terms of the why now, why them, like what is going on here, it really helped click for me was when the Idaho State Representative Julian Young said, when asked about the fact that she, was supporting a ban on gender affirming care, she said, I see this conversation as an extension of the pro-life argument. We're not talking about the life of the child, but we are talking about the potential to give life to another generation. And where that really clicked for me is also not just because, wow, she just said it out loud, like she just laid out the connection to the pro-life argument for us, but there's also this really, like to anyone who's familiar with that infamous quote by the neo-Nazi David Lane, where he says, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. That's a very reminiscent, like it's a very similar idea, this idea of like the potential to give life to another generation and preserving the future for white children is a very, very similar idea. One includes the word white, one doesn't, but the ideas are similar. And we can also guess that Julian Young was probably thinking of primarily white children in her context as well. So we see already the notion of the idea of white supremacy kind of rear its head, but also a rigid understanding of gender as a form of reproductive destiny, right? There's this idea that gender is what determines whether you're a mother or father, and that's your role in life, is to reproduce. And hence, we must preserve the potential to give life, right? The potential to reproduce, because that's all you should want in life. That is the kind of the pinnacle of human achievement in that kind of mindset, right? And hence, abortion is murder, and transition is treason, it's desertion. You're a deserter of your, God-given role in your gender, which also will surprise nobody that the pathologization of abortion and of transition is historically very similar. They often use almost the same justifications, like in Freudian terms and things like that, around why people would want that. And of course, it's all predicated on this idea that wanting to reproduce and wanting to stay in your quote-unquote God-given gender is just the natural thing you should want, and any deviation from that must be explained. So a lot of it is about naturalizing reproduction, naturalizing birth. And to that extent, the link to abortion is not even so much about actually preventing abortion at the individual level, so much as giving people this idea that it is their duty to reproduce. There's their duty to have children and reproduce. And it's that naturalization that trans people are a threat towards, right? Because how can parenting be in your nature if you can change your gender at will, right? How would that even work? The bio-essentialist argument relies on essentialism. And so so they do get at a hint of truth when they say that transition is mutilation, but it's not mutilation of the body, it's a mutilation of dominant gender ideology. It is really hitting back at this idea that how you're born in terms of reproductive capabilities is dictating what kind of life you should live and also what you should do with your life, which is also, of course, why in the politics of respectability response to these bans, there's a lot of emphasis first on medicine, of course, because medical power, but also emphasizing things like adoption and assisted reproductions instead of questioning the kind of imposed desire for parenting, right? Because there is this presumption that trans youth will want children in the future, and in fact should want children in the future, instead of actually questioning this idea of parenting as the end-all be-all of human life. So I think I'll pause here because I think Blue wants to bring us more into the discussion on white supremacy, but we can, circle back a little bit later as to how that comes into coalitional thinking and politics.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Florence, for sort of laying out for us, especially this idea of the child and the white child in particular. And I think that is where I'm going to sort of move us from, or really build out, that we have to keep in mind that here the presumption is that the trans child is a white child. Jules Gill-Peterson has a book called Histories of the Transgender Child that is really excellent, in which they really explore this idea of the trans child as a figure and really question how children serve as a metaphor under a lot of different rhetorics of supremacism. Right? Save the children. The children are being targeted by the secret Jewish cabal, right? They're being targeted by the trans people. They're being targeted. This idea of the vulnerable, in particular white youth, is really important. And there's lots of data out there that shows that youth of color are often not seen as children. Right? There's a lot of research out there that looks at the adultification of youth of color. So again, when we talk about whose children, what children, we really need to be talking about things like race. And so here, I want to draw on sort of where white Americans are in general, and especially because, as Alex pointed out, this isn't just about sort of fringe white supremacist groups, but about whiteness as a whole within this socio-political context. There's studies that demonstrate that white Americans tend to see racism as a zero-sum game, that they're losing. This is really important because under this thinking, white folks see themselves as victims in this winner-take-all battle between supposedly natural groups. And so this leads sort of to a central concern about social Darwinism, that whites as a group are losing out in comparison to other groups. And this has produced two central narratives that are both important to anti-CRT, it's important to anti-trans legislation, as well as to anti-abortion. And the first of these, as I'm sure some of y'all know, since you are here in this conversation, is the Great Replacement theory. The idea that white people are going to be placed in a numerical minority and that this is going to put them at a disadvantage in this winner-take-all battle. And then the second is about fears about sort of the declining white capacity for reproduction. This is what is usually termed the white genocide theory, right? Now, under both of these theories, there is a stark concern, not just with reproduction writ large, and not just with bolstering up bio-essentialist notions of gendered and sexed bodies, but of particular people having a responsibility to the nation state in reproducing. And so here is where claims about the reproduction of white children is put front and center, and how this is connected to other arguments that we see within supremacist thinking. For example, anti-CRT legislation has often been framed through the lens of white children feeling bad when they learn about the history of race in the United States. People saying that that is causing harm to children because it is making them think poorly of themselves. So again, this concern over protecting children is not a concern about protecting all children, but about protecting a certain group of children and their capacity for future acts of domination, about maintaining status and placement at the top of the hierarchy that we have in the United States. So I think that this is extremely important because this helps us understand how the politics of race, how the politics of immigration are coming together in our current debates around who is considered a child and whose reproduction matters. Just as a sort of brief aside, if we go into a broad spectrum history of things like abortion, abortion has not always been the issue that we think of it as today. When abortion was largely considered a practice focused on women of color, when it was largely seen as a practice that is a part of the carceral system, abortion was fine. For many of the people who would now define themselves as anti-abortion today, a lot of scholars have argued that this was because abortion was seen as a way of controlling non-white populations. The difficulty came when these same groups realized that the people taking most advantage of abortion services were white women, and white women of a certain class. this concern meant that these women were having not enough children, and therefore this was leading to a degradation in the stock of American citizens. And I say this specifically because of the way that the nation state, when we talk about who is demanding that these women have children, we're really talking about things at the nation state level, right? Scholars have talked about the fact that women played an important role in what has been termed manifest domesticity, and specifically white women's role in this, that having children was a way of settling the settler colonial apparatus as it expanded from the colonies on the East Coast to the West, right? And so quite literally, reproduction has been at the heart of the settler colonial apparatus as well. So what happens when folks aren't, when folks are seen as being targeted for procedures which will make them non-reproductive? Again, this fear about the future generations. And this is where we see anti-CRT, don't make us feel bad about being white, fits with, you should feel good about being white, and that's going to help you to reproduce, right? We should be producing more white people because that's producing more of that good population that we need to lift up, support, etc. And trans folks, again, being seen as primarily white, are then seen as the primary vector by which reproduction is being attacked. I want to just briefly pause and see if, Florence, did you want to add anything to that?
Not at this stage.
Okay, awesome. So a big part of this is that I think we want to emphasize is that whether you're talking about a perspective which is what we might consider more extreme in terms of anti-trans rhetoric, or whether it is a more liberal, or as Alex pointed out, right, the sort of logic of TERFs, of supremacism in supposedly left spaces, what we're seeing is the mainstreaming and normalization of bio-essentialism. In order for social Darwinism to be present, for its logic to make sense, we have to rely on the idea that populations are biologically distinct and that they're in some sort of race to the top, right? And the idea here is that white people, if they don't think in quote unquote race conscious ways, are going to be losing out in this battle to the death over group status. And so really, if we're trying to figure out why anti-CRT stuff is happening, if we're trying to figure out abortion bans, if we're trying to figure out anti-trans and specifically youth-focused anti-trans legislation, really what we have to be looking at is claims that, again, people have a biological and social imperative to reproduce not just children, but what children represent, which is things like white futurity, that white people will continue to exist. And I should note, when I say this, I don't mean necessarily white children in that biological sense, but as a group who receives benefits, status, and stratification as the top of the racial hierarchy within the United States. So with that, obviously we can go into sort of the politics more broadly in terms of the history of things like lynching and reproductive control that are a part of the history of the United States, and certainly a part of the conversation on supremacism. But what I really want to sort of underline here is that from everything from right-wing concerns over cucks and soy boys and liberal softies, claims that America is feminizing because it's no longer rugged and masculine. These concerns, yes, are concerns about gender, but they are concerns that the body of the nation is under attack, that it is being infiltrated. And for any of y'all who study supremacist movements, this should sound like, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a dog whistle, a pretty loud klaxon for mobilizing people in defense of stratification. And I want to sort of end at least my section with a description that I think is really helpful here, given by Corey Robin, who talks about in his book, The Reactionary Mind, sort of the nature of conservatism, because he says conservatism is not simply a set of ideologies. If we start thinking about it as if you're anti-abortion, then you are progressive, we're gonna miss a lot, right? As Alex has already said, there are clear instances in which sometimes leftist folks are out here using very conservative logic, right? The first suffragettes in the US were out here being like, how can we not have the vote when you gave the vote to Black men, right? Not a good look. That kind of logic is part of what Robin says is really what we need to track. That is what is at the root. And Robin says it's not about individual issues, but about the desire to naturalize and reinforce stratification. How can we move through the world in a way that makes the unequal distribution of resources, status, etc., natural and normal? And we're going to see that manifest in different ways during different historical periods. But that is the linkage that at least Robin makes the argument is something that tracks across supremacist manifestations writ large. So with that, I'm going to briefly turn it over. Florence, if you want to wrap us up with anything else, please feel free. And then I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, so, time back to, kind of circling back to the beginning where I was like, how do we understand attacks on trans youth care? And in here, I think I want to, offer some thoughts on like, what does it mean to make this argument that it's all connected? What does it change for organizing? And I think the first thing is, if all of these forms of repression are tied together, are facets of an overarching white supremacist agenda that is predicated on sexism, transmisogyny, transphobia, then we need to take that into account in developing practices of solidarity, because, well, if we don't, it's going to blow up in people's faces. And what we are noticing is that, unfortunately, at the kind of bigger level, cis feminists aren't showing up for trans people, right? There are cis feminists who are showing up, there are cis feminist groups that are showing up, but kind of the feminist establishment, the kind of bigger, more powerful mainstream feminist organizations and feminist voices are by and large not showing up. On the contrary, you see things like the New York Times, which, obviously not the largest feminist credentials, but has some writers that are purporting to be big feminists that are really buying into that anti-trans narrative, right? And that questioning of trans care, and oftentimes emphasizing the same things like reproduction and infertility. And it has very real ramifications. We are seeing it in the UK, where a lot of the groups that TERFs relied on to help them attack trans youth care now want to attack abortion using the same logic. And trans people sounded the alarm on that really early on, saying, hey, they're coming after like Gillick, which is the case that allowed abortion for adolescents. And it's also what allows you to consent to medical care in kind of all settings. And we're like, you know, you remember this precedent was actually about access to abortion. So if they're honing in on that, that's going to have ramifications for reproductive health. This is not an isolated thing. But, you know, there was much more investment in actually attacking access to trans youth care. And when we analyze things together, in fact, doing that analysis, showing how different forms of oppression are linked together, is really important, critical to building a coalitional politic that really strives for solidarity across difference. Because, and this is me pulling my kind of like cynical realpolitik hat, but the reality is, like, if you don't show people why attacks on you actually also pertain to them, they're not gonna show up. Even if they like care in theory, a lot of the time there's just an emotional investment thing. And, you know, as Alex said, we're all burnt out as well. So there's, so at times it's also understandable that people are focusing their energies, but by highlighting these connections, we can, you know, perhaps bring people together more and also establish a stronger common kind of grounds on which to fight back and defend ourselves. And so I do hope that we continue having more and more of those conversations, because that's something that in trans advocacy I've seen as oftentimes missing, is not really having these discussions about how things are connected. And so, you know, and it also, of course, goes always in notably, you know, white trans people have not always been the best, quite the contrary, at showing up, you know, when it came to racism and things like that, especially when it comes to the push towards the kind of turn towards the criminal law as a solution for transphobia, which, as we know, criminal law not a great thing in general. I mean, I say that as somebody who's going to be teaching it next fall, and yeah, not great. And so, yeah, okay. So now I don't have any, you know, fun and interesting sentence to end on. So I'll throw that back out to Blue if you have a good quote to end on.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think that here the goal of our analysis today is not just to be like, look, it's all fucked up and it's all fucked up together, but to be like, we all have our points of leverage, right? Audre Lorde, again, I always like to pull on the folks who came before, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Audre Lorde talks about organizing through the politics of difference. And this was something that Florence, a term that Florence used before, right? Like, what does it mean to not require us all to be the same or to be in the same experiences in order to mobilize? And I think that developing an analysis which helps us to track forms of supremacism, both within and without our movements, helps us to address how it helps us to pin down supremacism, even as that supremacism transforms. Even when we see things like bathroom bills turning into questions of trans youth health, right? It helps us to see how things like, for example, during that same push for anti-bathroom bills, there's a good book called Black Lives and Bathrooms, Racial and Gendered Reactions to Minority Rights Movements with Jay Somaru and Eric Anthony Grollman, where they talk about how white folks thought of the trans people in the bathrooms as being Black, and particularly being Black masculine folks in women's restrooms, right? And as Florence pointed out, that didn't catch on enough to effectively mobilize a large group of people. But by seeing how things like race were a part of that attack as well, we can see these processes both of transformation and refinement. If we only focus on individual instances, we only focus on the most urgent or pressing matter right in front of us, one, we have the tendency to rely on the same logics, right? The same forms of domination. Oh, hey, you could always adopt, right? We're gonna just keep using children logic as a sort of stand-in. Or we can ask ourselves, does this frame even serve us? And what are alternative frames that people have been using, deploying, living for a long time, right? And so, yeah, I just want to encourage folks to think of this analysis not in terms of everything is fucked up, but in terms of knowing how things are fucked up together means that we all have our own location where we can be pressing on this issue from all sides. We all have a stake in the outcome of rhetoric sounds too abstract, in the consequences of what is going on. And as Alex earlier talked about, discussing things as a culture war can sometimes really downplay that this is a question for many of us about life and death. This is a question of material struggle. As a Black trans person, seeing that North Carolina, which is where I am, is now trying to pass a parents' right to education bill, outlawing discussing sexuality and gender for kids, is saying that talking about my life is dangerous to children. And as a Black person, seeing stuff like AP, African American education, being gutted, changed, or completely excluded, says that I am quite literally being written out of the book of the nation state, right? And maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. Sometimes the anarchist in me is like, yeah, freedom. But like what it means is certainly a higher level of danger, right? And what do we do with and for each other? I think is something that we're gonna have to wrestle with together. I think I briefly saw a question about like, what does it look like to sustain? And maybe that's a place for us to start with our Q&A. It's great to have a good analysis, but it doesn't mean much if we're not doing something with it, and if it's not a livable practice. So I'm gonna turn it over to our moderator. Hook us up, tell us what's good.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of you for all of your remarks. They really kind of, really situate us and give us a way to conceptualize all of this. Before we go into the Q&A, I wanted to take some time to thank our funders and co-sponsors, the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity, Mary's Pence, and Social and Economic Justice Leaders for supporting our work and making webinars like this one and any of them that we'll have in the future, as well as our other anti-supremacist programming possible. So I just wanted to make sure we thank them for that. And so yeah, we'll go ahead and kick off the Q&A. We're going to invite people to ask your questions via the chat. You can also, if you would rather ask directly, you can use the digital hand raise feature that is located in the reactions function to speak. And we will just go ahead and open it up for that. I believe there is a question in the chat that we can start with, if that's okay. I know, Blue, you said you saw it. I can read this one also. It says, it's from Adrian Murillo. And they say, I think we need to counter the save the children messaging with respect the children, respect their right to be who they want to be, respect their diversity and individuality, respect their intelligence and awareness, respect their idealism as a call back to sanity in these times of irrational extremism. And so they say that their question is, can we sustain that kind of campaign that covers all youth, BIPOC, queer, trans, and white?
Do you want to go, or?
You know what? I'm gonna let you take a stab at that, and I'll go second.
So I'll start with the first kind of well, I guess it's technically more of a common question, but actually it's like really more of a question framed as a comment. So the respected children of Save the Children, I think, brings up like really interesting things about images of childhood. And there is this there's work that's been done on this idea of like the Dionysian versus the Apollonian images of childhood, and this idea of children as dangerous as this kind of like idea that used to be like very, very popular, and moving towards this idea of children as really sort of innocent, and then moving towards an idea perhaps a little bit more of children as adults in waiting, which has its own issues, because I mean, my tendency in my work when I work with children is really seeing like children as persons in the here and now, persons that are dependent in many ways and thus must be approached as such, but still as fully blown persons and not just adults in waiting, and thus as people who need to be considered in the here and now. But then the question is, well, are we sufficiently far along this idea of children as persons to actually make a message like respect the children work? And I don't think so. That's the unfortunate kind of answer. Like parenting is still essentially fascism today. Your kind of average kind of mainstream parenting is very, very kind of dogmatic, very violent in many ways. I still think that a big part of why people act really shitty as adults is because we've all been traumatized as children, because we're treated as what it means to be treated as children is really poorly, right? You know, the shit that's normalized. I mean, I remember as a kid where like, you know, getting like assaulted was just considered normal, right? Like in schools and stuff. And of course that makes people that aren't like that brings its trauma. And if you don't work through that trauma, then, you know, you don't necessarily treat people right. But then a lot of people come to adulthood with that idea of like, well, I had to go through this and I turned out fine, which, I mean, did you turn out fine if you're thinking that way? But you know, but there's this idea of like, I had to go through this and now you have to go through this. And so that's kind of the first part of the answer is like, well, I think we're still too much stuck in this idea of like children as in need of protection and in need of really paternalism, but also ironically, this idea of protection is quite violent in many ways. So that's the kind of first part. And the second part is sustaining that kind of campaign covers all youth. Well, the second part of my answer here is that to the extent that this idea of the child is vulnerable, which is the Apollonian idea of childhood, has kind of taken mainstream hold, it's one that's still not applied to children of color, and especially Black children. Black children are still largely being seen under a Dionysian lens, where they are seen as dangerous, and specifically dangerous to the white children who are seen under an Apollonian lens. So that creates another barrier to this kind of campaign, and which ties directly to what Blue said about the adultification of youths. I think in many ways the Dionysian model and vision of childhood is in part morphing to include a lot of adultification today as a way of justifying this disparity in keeping a Dionysian view for children of color, and especially Black children, and keeping the Apollonian model for white children. So in this regard, I wish that we could counter it with respect to children. I think that's really compelling, but I don't think it's gonna be compelling as a kind of mainstream like argument.
Yeah, I just going off that, yes, I'm right there with Florence in terms of being like, no, I don't know if that's gonna do it. I do think that we really need to be talking about autonomy. And that a big part of what I'm hearing when you say respect the children is a movement that recognizes that children's autonomy is severely infringed on, and that with that infringing comes a lot of projection, right? A lot of putting parents' wishes and desires, a lot of ignoring what children have to say or what they want for their own bodies, because that is seen as, again, dangerous, subversive. Parents need to bring their kids in line. This is also tied to a lot of religious stuff, right? So if we actually look at Christian supremacism and looking at like the idea of bringing up good children is also about disciplining them away from sinfulness, right? So frameworks that say you should trust yourself don't resonate within those kinds of frameworks. So I think that, to your point, would a move to address or to strengthen the autonomy of children be helpful? Yes. Is there a movement, or could it be like a movement that says respect children? Would that be effective? No. And I think for many of the reasons that Florence already addressed, which is that children are not a homogenous group, and their autonomy is infringed on in different ways. So when Black children are adultified and are treated as dangerous, their autonomy is being infringed on in a different way than how the child who is depicted as innocent and needing to be saved, protected, how their autonomy is being infringed. If we were to take it away from children and just think feminism more generally, right? White women in, say, second wave feminism were like, please, like, we need to get out of the house. We have been privatized, right? Like, we have been pushed out of the public sphere. That was not how Black women felt that their autonomy was best going to be served, because they were out in the workforce doing the shit, because that was the nature of their relationship with white supremacy and misogyny, right? Now, does that mean that those white women shouldn't be able to be free from being paternalized and isolated? No, but it means that if we want an effective movement, we need to see how those things are different if we're going to get us towards increase the autonomy of children writ large.
There's also a big difficulty in arguing for youth autonomy that I unfortunately get to live a little bit too much for my taste, because I write papers about how we should give more autonomy for children and we should recognize children's capacity to consent to care and stuff like that, which means that, and of course I partly did this to myself, which is to say I set up an app that tells me when my name is mentioned on Twitter. And is it self-harm? Partly. Is it also a great way of keeping track of what's being said and when I'm going to be part of like a harassment campaign? Also serves as a great heads up. But one thing I do notice a lot is people repeatedly mentioning my work on, arguing for youth capacity to consent to medical care, and then essentially either suggesting or directly claiming that that makes me a pedophile and that I have an ulterior motive on that, which, first of all, clearly, I mean, just completely missing the point as to what the issue of consent, how it works out here, and the fact that medical consent, first of all, not at all the same thing, but also the age difference. There's no, what's the equivalent to the age difference and exploitation in medical care? It's not the same at all. But regardless, if you make these kinds of arguments, you're going to be accused of being a pedophile. And right now, they already love to call everybody groomers, and in fact, they do so because people are arguing for youth to be able to have that decision about themselves, right? And so, in many ways, respect the children, that might, convince people who are already convinced, but for people who are opposed to that, that proves their point, right? It just kind of confirms their preconceived idea of why people are arguing for that, which is with ulterior motives. And so I think that's also one of the unfortunate downsides of doing that kind of work.
And I should note that this also, just to go along with, because Alex was talking about things like comprehensive sex ed, right? And something that continues to be an issue is that when we do sex ed, so much of it is like avoid, like don't get an STI and die, right? Like don't get pregnant. And it's not about pleasure or about enjoyment or about, like, again, consent, because the idea of saying, hey, kids, you are doing these things and there are ways to do them safely and pleasurably becomes like, people are fine with it preventing disease, but saying that we could be having a better collective sexual culture, saying that pleasure is important, becomes, again, immediately a site for, well, we need to protect children.
Yeah, this is also a huge difference that we have in Canada and the US, which is, so, in Canada, what is known as Romeo and Juliet laws in the US are baseline. And so in Canada, youth are able to consent to sex as young as 12, so long as the age difference is small. And so there is this idea that you can have a positive sexual life so long as it's not in a large age gap, which brings up issues of abuse of power and exploitation and all sorts of awful stuff. And I think what seems to have become kind of like, yeah, that's just how things are in Canada, where there's this idea of like, yeah, kids have sex with kids. That's what happens. It's just what it is, and that's fine. And we just must ensure that, one, it's safe, and two, it's as pleasurable as possible. But the people that are arguing against gender affirming care, none of them want kids to be having sex, right? None of them want 16-year-olds to be having sex. No one wants 17-year-olds to be having sex. I'm sure they'd be happy if their children didn't have sex until 25. Well, actually, that's probably not true because they want them to start pumping out babies. But you know, there's this. But there's
married in a good
that,
heterosexual relationship.
I know, but only married. But you know, the thing is that Republicans are very happy with marriage as young as like 14. But
Ooh.
Can I interject here?
Oh.
I was just about to say, yes, please, Adrian, go ahead.
Because I want to expand on this. I mean, I hear everybody's doubts and hesitations and fears, but my question is, if not us, who? If not now, when? I think that there's other points to make, and I agree, the comprehensive sex, respect their right to comprehensive sex ed, respect their humanity as moral equals, and respect their brave vulnerability for what it teaches us adults about how numb we have become. Respect their dreams as a critical counterpoint to the glut of dystopian stories sweeping this culture. All of that stuff. I did this as an email message I'm in North Idaho, to local friends and allies. And one of them was a friend of mine who is the president of the high school chapter of our local human rights task force. And he asked me to come to speak to their club about this. And I also had my fears and doubts, you know, and I said yes, but then I thought about it. But I ran into him and his father recently and expressed that. And he said, don't worry, you know, we got your back, come and speak to us. But my intention is to help mentor youth to be organized, to take the ball and run with this idea, to organize around it. And for us adults to just be supportive and mentors and tutors and that kind of thing. We can't let our fear slow us down. I'm an older person, baby boomer age, but I'm Chicano queer. And I've been in social services for many years, including at one point I was youth coordinator for the Gay and Lesbian Community Service Center in Hollywood, doing street outreach to the thousands of gay runaway youth, queer kids coming into Hollywood every day. And so I made that conviction. I got the conviction that we need to change the system instead of putting out fires and working with kids on the street like we do. And I came of age during a youth empowered movement in the 60s and 70s. And so we need to help youth be empowered to start organizing for their own rights and demand their own respect. And if it's not us, who will do it? And if it's not now, when will we do it? And I respect the hesitations, believe me, I'm in North Idaho. I live with that fear all the time, but my anger has to be stronger than my fear.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian, for pushing for, and also just articulating that youth have a right to autonomy, right, over themselves and their spaces. I think for me, I should say my answer is not like, don't do this. Rather, that when I think about a slogan like respect children, right? Is that where, like, what does that potentially do to homogenize all of those amazing voices, right? Or to centralize those voices under the folks that are going to have the most resources, status, etc. And so really my thing here is more of a let's do it, and let's do it with the consideration that we want to avoid reproducing those same practices of, say, anti-Blackness, etc. Right? So yeah, I just want to put out there that when I say I'm hesitant, when I say I'm like, is that framework of sort of a unified representation of youth, to me, isn't going to be the thing. What it sounds like you're focusing on is the kind of grassroots empowerment that I think helps to avoid some of those problems of homogenization that folks like Florence and I were trying to name or to pull out.
I hear you.
Yeah, and I, also agree, because I mean, I'm still arguing for youth autonomy, right? Like I'm not stopping, I haven't stopped. And in fact, it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of my scholarship as time goes on, because, getting on very unfortunately increasingly relevant. But I think like, especially like, like my fears around respect children, especially like, is particularly as a slogan around like trans youth and fighting back in this particular arena. And my feelings would be kind of different in sort of different contexts. And I think circling back to Blue's concerns, one of the issues here is that specifically for like around bans on trans youth care, is that there's relatively little trans youth voices there, because they're very rightfully scared as fuck. They get an insane amount of harassment, and and both just in kind of like day-to-day life, but then on top of that, you have to, once you get into politics, you have to deal with, the amount of harassment, of death threats and stuff like that is just, almost impossible to bear. And so understandably, a lot of people don't do that. I mean, even in easier times around kind of like 2015, 2016, I knew a number of kids in where I was from in Quebec that were really active in politics and pushing for access to gender marker changes in the province for minors. And they've all stopped activism because they just couldn't take it anymore, all the attention and all the stuff. And we even had to go back and scrub their name off the internet and get newspapers to remove their name and everything, which was thankfully much easier back then, just in terms of convincing journalists and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, there's, and then, what does it mean to get a slogan like respect children when, we're only, we're trying to represent their perspectives as much as we can, but they're not the main ones being involved in those fights. They're, even if you look at legislative hearings, there are trans youth there, but they're not the majority of people that are speaking out against these laws. Yes, in part because they're not being given that voice, but also in part because it's just a lot. I mean, even for adults, it's a lot. And also, I mean, one of the things is a lot of the adults who do that stuff do it as more or less of a full-time job. Children can do that. They have to go to school. They have to, do all of that other stuff, which is a full-time job, sometimes even more. And then they have to do their activism, which are not being paid for. There is a lot of that difficulty, I think, in terms of the organizing. And then that's where I think there's also part of my hesitancy to like respect the children is like, it ends up being making a slogan kind of essentially adults making a slogan for children, which would be very different in, say, the context you're speaking of, doing kind of grassroots work, and especially grassroots work that seems to be more local than a lot of the kind of fights that are happening right now legislatively around trans youths.
All right. Thank you for those remarks and for that question, Adrian. I'm going to go ahead to Bianca, who has their hand up as well.
Thanks so much for everyone who's here and sharing. One of the things as a youth worker and educator that I've learned, specifically as a sex educator, that I want to invite us to consider when we talk about mentorship. This was a really core component of my training, where people were like, find mentors, find mentors. But what I've learned is that I need youth mentors. I don't just need elders who are mentors or peers who are mentors. And I want to invite us to remember and recall that young people organized on Snapchat, nationwide walkout around gun violence. They really don't need us as adults with power over them, doing something or telling them what to do. I believe young people already know what's needed. They need us to show up in support of them as leaders. And it requires us to do a collaborative approach, not one where we're considered the ones with all the answers. And that requires us to shift that power that we have as adults in learning spaces and collaborative spaces. It's hard, but it also is a different way of connecting with young people that I found is really fulfilling in a way that my training never invited me to consider until I was in my 40s. I wanted to offer a question. I know we probably don't have to get to it now, but I was wondering, to dovetail into this conversation about young people, I'd love to hear our presenters talk a little bit about the way that ableism and disability shows up in the work that you do. Because as a disabled person working with disability community and disabled youth, nobody wants disabled youth procreating or having more disabled children, right? So here's an area where disabled people are not welcomed into a conversation about elective abortion. And if they are, they're being used for white right-wing argument. So I'd love to hear the ways that ableism show up or informs the work that you do. And I'll put that in the chat if it's not time for that question yet. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond to that. This was something that I was thinking about sharing because this recently was a statement by Representative Eastman of Alaska, who said that it's a benefit to society when children who are victims of abuse die because, quote, there aren't needs for government services over the course of that child's life. And so this is a straight up statement from a US representative that really speaks to, Bianca, what you're talking about around disability and the child, right, that we imagine, and procreation, right? This idea of reproduction and whose reproduction is desirable, right? I think with both Florence and I'll speak more for myself, that in my work, I also see disability overlapping with race in the way that race is constructed through the lens of disability. Some of the first mental disorders categorized in the United States were things like drapetomania, which was a disease. It was described as a disease in which slaves wanted to be free. And this was described as a mental disorder because it clearly had to be a mental deficit if you didn't want to remain under the system of slavery, right? And so the way that we construct disability is highly racialized. And so I first want to note that those things have this overlapping history. I think that, again, from conversations I've had with other scholars, I'm a disabled scholar, so having those conversations with other people, I'm a disabled scholar, but I'm not a scholar of disability. I think that's important to clarify. I have the experiences, but I don't necessarily have the full breadth of expertise to speak fully to your question. But part of what disability studies scholars have discussed is the infantilization of adults with disabilities, right? And the assumption that they are perpetual children and therefore never able to make choices about their own reproduction, right? And so to me, this goes along with what other scholars like Ryan Cartwright have looked into, which is that the cleansing of American populations, and I say this very specifically, that the eugenic practices around race, many of which were started with the application to like rural white folks who were deemed more likely to be disabled, intellectually disabled, physically disabled, that they needed to be controlled. And that their disabilities led them to deviant family styles. Think about how we depict disability historically, like in horror films, right? The depiction of the sort of rural, backwoods, inbred family. All of that really plays on this idea that disabled folks are children and therefore aren't autonomous. If you articulate that you have some disability, that documentation can then be used against you, right? In order to infantilize you. Not to be the queer in the room, but like the Free Britney stuff, right? Like, oh, Britney Spears having children like is bad because look at her, she's not fit, right? And this question of fitness is really important to the work that Florence and I have looked at, right? Because it's not just about producing white children. They want a particular kind of white child. Early eugenicists in the United States believed that white Americans were different than European Americans because they had gone through the environmental selection pressures of the frontier, and that made them more rugged and better stock. That's the kind of better stock that is being pushed for, right? It's not disabled white folks, right? It is about creating self-contained, independent, rugged individualism, capitalist, producing laborers, right? Everyone else is considered surplus population. And this is a term that folks like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, right, like explores when talking about prisons and other forms of social death. So yeah, I want to say it is not something that I focus on in my particular work, but it is something that I am thinking about and have reflected on because of its overlapping nature with a lot of the areas that I do study.
Yeah, I want to just add on this. Blue brought up eugenics and supremacism around disability is one of the, longest standing, most core, such a deeply mainstream part of society that it's not even recognized as such. Ableism is just kind of inherent to how most of our societal structures function and what is considered acceptable culture. So this is definitely something that has come up in our work. It's of course intertwined, with bodily autonomy, with reproductive autonomy, legacies of forced sterilization, the same as Blue pointed out, things that used against disabled people that are also used against women of color and immigrant women and trans people, and that they practice a lot of these kinds of supremacist techniques on people with disabilities. vulnerable population. And so this is definitely something that, about the concept of supremacism, superiority, dominance, oppression, invisibility, really deeply intertwined with that. And as we go through the webinar series over the course of this year and in our programming, I think that this is a topic that we will definitely look at visiting in more depth so that we have bring on scholars of disability who can talk more deeply about how rooted that is and how, which I recommend, we'll be posting the recording soon of the panel from our talk in December, which Blue spoke on about mental and emotional health for researchers, which also brought in issues of disability and the hostility towards disability and the erasure of disability as elements of how we think of our own traumas and the acceptability of our traumas, our needs, our personal disabilities, and how that factors into things like, what is sort of colloquially known as burnout, that has so much to do with the structures of society that we're in and how they support and specifically don't support us in our variable identities. So we'll send out that recording next week, along with the recording of this panel to our email list. And definitely a topic that we'll dig into more. And the other thing I wanted to recognize from Bianca was the original comment about young people and young people as, empowered in of themselves and as mentors to others. And to just name that we definitely deeply support that at IRMS, and all of our programs are neutral to age or career status. We don't have like a lot of systems do that, this group is for the professors and this is for the students and these kinds of things. It's based on what people are bringing to our fellowship programs or mentee programs or training programs, and learning at all ages and all levels in different ways. And so we try to break out of that in the construction of our work as well, and in the kind of, importance that we put on interventions that are occurring, done for, and by. And our keynote speaker, one of our keynote speakers, Mel William Hang Jaggers, the executive director of GLSEN, they put it really well in an interview that children and young people are doing really amazing, inspiring work, and also that like they should get to be children, in such as they should get to have fun, they should get to study, they should get to explore themselves. They shouldn't have to be always at the forefront of these movements. And so the responsibility of adults and groups like GLSEN to recognize them, respect them, empower them, support them, and also to not kick back and feel like the young people can do it for us, to be like, yeah, those youth are really amazing. That's fascinating. Follow their lead, use their resources, develop the work in this way so that we are, supporting, in the same way that that we, empower and provide resourcing for any community that is often marginalized or voiceless.
Yeah, and then, coming back to the question of like, how does children work? I mean, I don't think you can do trans studies without thinking through and around disability, even if you know even if you write directly about it in different degrees, for like so many reasons. The first one is trans people are disabled, not as a group, but a hell of a lot of trans people are disabled. Really a lot. I mean, for one, you know, depression, anxiety, and PTSD is like kind of a mainstay. But then, you know, like things like autism, ADHD, and I mean, everything really tends to be more common among trans people. And so first you have to, you know, you can't do this work without thinking about that fact and how it impacts the kind of advocacy we do, because, well, for one, you know, like just think about all the criteria for transitioning. There are like, oh, you must, you know, all mental health concern must be reasonably well under control. And then it's like, oh, they're trying to use that to deny care to, you know, 50% trans people because they're disabled. There's also the sense that trans people are disabled in, you know, like straight up as a matter of law in many countries, including Canada. Being trans qualifies you as disabled as a matter of law. And, you know, in part, it's still recognized that way under a lot of like the DSM and things like that. And so there's the question of like, how do trans people engage with that? And of course, trans people have historically tried to distance themselves from that. But we are also seeing pushback from many people, kind of myself included, about where that distancing comes from. Because, you know, while I do believe in the depathologization movement and this idea of like being trans is not a pathology, it can't be done from a place of, ew, mental illness, you know? You can't be like, no, you know? You can't push depathologization from an ableist perspective, which is why in some of my work I've been very actively trying to develop ways of making sense of depathologization from a perspective that's not ableist, notably by like centering what do classifications of illnesses bring to people and how do people self-conceptualize, and essentially like basically taking a very kind of like what counts as an illness or a disability is socially constructed. What do categorizations bring? Does it do good or does it not? And kind of using that as a frame. Then there's the second way in which, you know, it comes up a lot, which is transness is disabling in many ways. You know, the most obvious ways is my body has scars, right? My body doesn't produce certain hormones, never did, and some not anymore. And that has, you know, lifelong medical impact on me. And so there is that aspect. But then, you know, there's the kind of bad side of that in how people react to it, which is seeing it as calling it mutilation or monstrous, or turning towards it with pity, and then or even kind of horror, really, which is tied to this kind of mutilation framing. And so there is this need to push back, and a lot of that reaction to trans bodies is reaction to disabled bodies. It's the same kind of gut negative reaction that is being transposed onto trans people. It's a fundamentally ableist perspective, and so is the pity towards which they turn in arguing against access to trans care. Another way in which it shows up is how it's constantly being used to argue against trans care, how the fact that disabled people exist and are accessing trans care is evidence that they need to be saved, right? And so you have, especially this shows up quite a lot around sexual trauma, which is typically not framed around in kind of disability terms by opponents, but one that really is autism, right? And this idea of like, we need to save the autistic youth from the gender, the gender ideology and stuff like that, which, I have to obviously take issue with, both on the human level, but also as somebody who's autistic. And one thing that's interesting in here is well, that reproduction, the argument from reproduction doesn't typically show up in that context, right? When they're emphasizing autistic youth, it's very much framed as a separate point, a separate argument from the reproduction one. And this does say something. And what's interesting at the same time is I'm thinking of Ashley X, and I don't know if people know Ashley X, but it's was a person who was born in 1997, and due to encephalopathy had essentially developmental disability, and was being basically was publicly framed as being stuck in the mind of a newborn with a growing body, and was controversially by the courts given puberty blockers and essentially stop the bodily development to essentially always stay a baby. And Ashley is like 27 now, 26, 27 now. As far as I know, we don't know how she's doing now or anything. All we know is that her puberty was stopped and she was given the blockers that are now being, given to trans kids. And, there's this differential treatment where this was seen as kind of saving Ashley X, but then turn around and, trans kids, it would be so horrendous to give them puberty blockers, and even the autistic trans kids, right? And so there's a rich and really distressing web and interplay in how infantilization, disability, and transness are intersecting in ways that really show the seams of the arguments that are being made, of the claims that are being made, and really shows how it really has nothing to do with the arguments that they are making on the surface, about protecting children, stuff like that, and everything to do with gender, race, disability, and fulfilling the demands of the nation state imagined as white.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm gonna turn it over, I believe, to Alex to field some questions about the Training Institute. I believe you had gotten a message, so if you want to, if anyone has particular questions, they can, ask her directly using the raise hand function. But if you want to briefly talk about it a bit, Alex, that would be great as well.
Yeah, so I think given where we are on time, first I want to mention from the chat that Bianca recommended the open access reading Black Feminist Disability Framework by Drs. Moya Bailey and Azita Mobley, who Blue is snapping to that reading as well. So for listeners to be aware of. And I think so it was requested that I give some more details on the Anti-Supremacist Training Institutes and also our fellow and mentee programs. I'm going to invite if there's any final questions related to Florence and Blue's presentation, and if not, kind of final remarks from the two of them, because I know we've been 2 hours, a lot of people need to go and do things. And this is recorded, we'll send it out. And so if people need to leave, for the people who have already left, the information that I provide will be on the recording, and you can get it that way if you don't want to stay for questions. So yeah, if there's if Blue and Florence, if you want to give your final comments, that would be great. And then I will give a little bit more details on the programming that we have coming up.
All right. Well, I mean, my final thoughts are that I really hope that people will kind of take this conversation as an entry point and really develop their own thinking around this and develop practices of solidarity around this. I don't think I can go terribly much farther than that in my thoughts, because sharing what I truly think might get me in trouble and get me fired. So I won't. But let's say shake up the system very politely. You know, we're at a time that's really scary. It's really scary to be trans, but it's really scary for really anybody who's marginalized. It's incredibly scary right now. And fear, and that's something I've been struggling with, fear can be immobilizing, and it can make it difficult to do that work. And I think that's where solidarity is its most important. Is yes, it's about the work that gets done when people show up, but it's also about this kind of revitalization that we experience when people show up. It's about people showing up as fuel for those fights, and that when people show up, it's not a zero-sum game where they're like putting their energy in there instead of somewhere else. It gives us all more energy to do that work. And so that's why I, really believe in showing up and doing that work. And I hope we can all do it together.
Yeah, just building off that, I really just want to go back to Bianca's question and challenge for us, because, Florence and I have developed this analysis, but just like with any work, it is limited. And there's so much further that this kind of analysis of power and supremacism, further that it could grow. And so I also want to really think about inviting all of y'all to take this sort of framework and develop it in your own areas with your own skill sets and experiences. If you're doing youth work, I want to see this argument about supremacism grow into an analysis of the ways that we infantilize children and how that is related to things like disability and race. And so, yeah, I want to first offer up that this is not a be-all, end-all, and it should not be seen as a be-all, end-all analysis. When we say we're trying to grasp something at the root, it takes many hands, right? We've got this part, but there's certainly more to explore. I also just want to sort of end with a recognition that it is okay to be afraid. It is okay to have fear. And it's also okay to freeze. That is a response to trauma, and it can be a survival response. And it's not bad to feel overwhelmed. And I say that because sometimes in our movement spaces, we get really focused on like, you need to be doing things all the time. And that isn't the case. The goal, I think, of the kind of active organizing work that folks, Alex, that Florence, like folks have been talking about, is about showing up for others from the places where we have strength. So that when that person is feeling frozen and really scared, that they know that they have people in their corner that have capacity. That way, we allow people to experience a full range of human emotion. Like, I am Black and I am trans and I am not a superhero, right? Like, I am not, like, I don't need to be out here being ready to take down the entire system. That is the job of a collective, right? Of us working together. And so when Florence says very politely to shake things up, really thinking about where your position, where your points of leverage are, right? And avoiding this idea of if you don't do everything, then you're doing nothing, right? Again, Audre Lorde's Politics of Difference. You organize from where you're different in order to get everyone on that same page of being dignified and supported and having their needs met. So yeah, I just really want to end the discussion, for at least for myself, from a place of saying, knowing that these things are interconnected, as Florence said, means that we all are in this together. There is no, this isn't going to affect me somehow. So if we're all in this together, we have these overlapping positions. My challenge to all of y'all is to say, where are you going to take your next steps? What does that look like? Because when we show up for one another, we end up building power, right? Samuel Delaney talks about this as the power of masked bodies, that there's just something different when people come together as a group to accomplish a goal. And as Alex brought up, so much when we talk about things like healing and about doing this research and doing this work can feel very isolating. Like we are the only folks, and you know, getting the hate mail and getting doxxed and getting all of these experiences can feel very isolating. So countering that is essential to doing the kind of sustained work that I think we were challenged at the beginning of our Q&A to think about. So yeah, I think that's it for me. And I really appreciate folks showing up and bringing some insights and hard questions to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Blue and Florence, for those remarks. I really appreciate, especially, the comments about how important connections are. And a big part of this training institute is forming those connections, because like you were saying, Blue, this work can feel very isolating and it can lead to this despair. And, you know, like you were saying, you know, about we can't afford to throw our hands up and say, you know, well, it's just messed up. That's not necessarily the point of this. It's to show that we do have power in our solidarity and in our numbers. So thank you all so much for articulating that. And I also, just as a quick note, I've been taking resources from the chat to just keep track of, so that we'll send out a just a follow-up, a thank you for everyone that attended. So if anyone has any other resources that they want to share, I'm kind of over here taking notes. So if you have anything else, I will share that out in the next week or so. And then, yeah, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Alex to talk a bit more about the Institute.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you to our speakers and our audience. Really amazing to be there, and wonderful to have all of the people who will be listening to this recording in the future. So we are really excited for this year to be able to dig deep into our research and action on anti-supremacism. Props again to CGRE, which is funding so much of this program. So there's going to be some different dimensions to the program, and also some other corresponding programming. So this public training is part of a series of public webinars that we'll do around anti-supremacism that will be in conjunction with the Training and Creation Institutes and cohort building. So these sessions will provide on an approximately monthly basis deep dives into different areas of supremacism. Next month's talk will include Amy Littlefield, a journalist who works on abortion, who will be digging into the history and strategy used by the anti-abortion movement. And our other speakers are to be announced. So if you are interested in joining our anti-supremacist training and creation institutes for this year, so these will go beyond the public webinars. We'll be aiming to build a cohort of 30 to 40 social justice organizers, researchers, and media who are interested in deeper collaborations around innovative ways to counter supremacism, to rewrite supremacism, because I always feel like, we're countering, like we're contesting, like I don't know about those words. So we're trying rewrite supremacism right now. And so we'll be bringing people together at different events. We'll have virtual options and in-person options. Our big in-person event will be in May from the 11th to 14th in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where I'm based. New Mexico is a safe harbor state. Arizona and Texas are not on either side. And so we'll really be focused on doing more work around anti-abortion movements, anti-birth control movements, which are hopping on to the anti-abortion train, anti-sex ed, movements against transgender rights, especially targeting trans youth in places like Texas, and drag shows and performances and books about queer youth and librarians and those attacks. We are planning to have, as part of our community joy building, a mix of different types of sessions at this institute. So there will be a little bit of presentations and talks, but not too much because we'll be doing the webinars beforehand. There will be then convenings and breakout groups, figuring out strategies around certain topics. What we do with our brief application forms, they're basically for us to learn about the challenges that organizers are facing, and what researchers and media are bringing. So we have some plans for our topics and who's going to speak at the upcoming trainings, but we leave a lot of it flexible and we design it directly based on what kind of issues people bring up. So for our pilot institute, which was in 2021, we had people asking about topics like why the white nationalist group was harassing the high school gay straight alliance, how a candidate for city council whose platform had been all about anti-LGBTQ programming was now working with the white supremacist kind of group. And we're like, we can so answer that. We can get into that. We know these things, they make sense. Let's talk intersections. Let's talk misogyny as glue. So we have this focus for May around things broadly, kind of anti-bodily autonomy, anti-gender expression kind of work. And then we will also be looking at the applications and what organizers are facing in their own work and what their needs are, what they need to understand, what they need to work on. And then we will also be having just stuff for people to get to know each other, to build relationships. The concept of the cohort is that we'll be doing things over the course of the whole year. So the in-person event in May, if you're able to come to New Mexico, travel and lodging is fully funded, childcare and caretaking also as needed, and stipends for any low-income individuals giving up uncompensated paid work to come to the convening. We'll spend some time outside. We have some really nice canyons here. The aim is to have not only discussions with drag artists about the work that they are doing and the issues that they're facing, but also to have some performance because we really want to build that joy. So there will be really great engaging sessions to really dig into what we can do innovatively. How do we make the case? How do we design the how-tos? What's going to make sense? We'll also have some events with other conferences. In July, the 22nd Century Initiative will be having a conference in Minneapolis. We'll be doing a pre-conference there. Will be another place to meet up. We'll have a virtual training institute for people who aren't able to attend the May one in person. And then we'll have this cohort build and collaborate in different ways over the course of the year. So we're aiming to do case studies of innovative techniques that participants in the convening might use in their own organizing that they want to disseminate more broadly. We'll be doing reports, making the case for things like what I discussed earlier, that things like attacks on drag performance or trying to ban books from libraries or attacking sex ed at the local school board level aren't distractions. They're the core of the authoritarian agenda, and making that case for how we want to think about prevention and how we want to think about change. We're going to be doing how-tos. We're going to be creating resources for media. And so people who are part of the cohort will have the opportunity to both work in these in-person and virtual sessions to learn more and to engage with one another around how we can do better to support effective organizing and cultural and educational change. And then they'll also have the opportunity, based on interest and capacity, to be involved hands-on with the creation of some of these resources, which there's additional funding to support as well. So if people out of the Institute just have the time to be a part of the strategy and the brainstorming and the sessions themselves, that's okay. And if people from the Institute want to be involved with helping to create some of these materials, there will be opportunities for researchers and organizers and media to connect around that as well. And the cohort won't be completely static. So if people come to the organizer training and then want to bring in others, we'll have more events in the fall that have yet to be fully scheduled. And this is really about developing a long-term project for researchers coming at this work, for organizers coming at this work, for media coming at this work from an anti-supremacist framework, or who want to come at it from an anti-supremacist framework, as I explained, what that means to us earlier about recognizing supremacism in the mainstream, about core change, about creativity in work. And so we'll be growing this cohort over time and looking for it to be a sustained part of the work. Because one big part of the kind of interventions that we do and the levels that we work on is we're not campaign focused in most of the work that we do, those applications can totally come out of it. But we are thinking about change that needs to happen over the course of decades. When you start if you manage to have comprehensive sex education starting in kindergarten for the whole country, just all of a sudden, it would still take a long time for all of those youth to grow up and go through that programming and be of voting age and starting to make cultural and political decisions. So we work on the long-term frame. We think about what those balances are. I think the overturning of Roe put that really into a lot of people's sights. A lot of compromising language has traditionally been used around abortion instead of really digging into bodily autonomy and human rights. A lot of reasons and excuses why people should be allowed to have abortions. That wasn't just kind of a hard stop, that because bodily autonomy, because it's their right. And there have been a lot of losses kind of related to having given supremacists the grounds for them to attack on all sorts of things. There was a New York Times article about pro-life young women, as they refer to themselves, using the messaging of we're the ones who tell women they can have it all, because the pro-choice movement tells them, they can't afford to have their babies. And we tell them they can have a baby and they can have a career and all this stuff. And of course, actually, the left is also the place that supports resources for raising children, which people on the right constantly knock down. The supremacist agenda does not want to support, especially any non-white babies. But that's not what's coming through in the messaging. And for our movements to think about what we're doing, we really want to lean into, and here's the other reason we don't use just extremist or radicalization, because we want to lean into radical social justice, because radical is actually a really great term in a lot of ways, and research shows that people in the center are actually often more authoritarian because they think democracy means voting, and that it doesn't mean protest, and it doesn't mean free speech, and it doesn't mean anything that interferes with what is seen as civility or respectability politics. So they don't really support social movements. And so we actually want a vision that is radical, that's inspiring, and that thinks about the kind of change that we can make in the long term. And when we look at supremacist movements, and this is what I did my dissertation research on, how the right or supremacist movements built power from the 1960s forward, they're really inspiring. Their rhetoric is super inspiring. I don't agree with any of it. I think it's all terrible, but really inspiring. And they lost a lot. They lost really badly. Barry Goldwater carried like 2 states, and they were like in the presidential election, and they were like, that's a huge success. Did you see how many people voted for him? We can build on this. We just need to change the culture, change the educational system, make people understand what we call conservatism, bring them over to us. So we're going to be getting into all of that kind of stuff in these cohorts and in the resources that we're building. So this is a project that is very collaborative, is meant to be built with the people who are a part of it. We have people at IRMS and people who we've worked with in the past who will be involved with it. And we want to bring in new people and new contacts and new relationships who are interested in building the way that we're interested in building around rewriting supremacism and around a vision for the future that we want. The other programming we have at IRMS that's ongoing is that our fellows and mentee cohorts are currently open. So for researchers in academia or elsewhere, we have journalists in this program as well. This is another area that you can look at. We encourage our researchers to be involved with our programs. Blue is one of our fellows at IRMS, as they mentioned previously. So our fellows often speak at our webinars. We encourage them to participate in the connection between research and action that can look different ways for different people. We have people who do media interviews and op-eds, other forms of talks, engagement with resources. We do a small orientation program for fellows, which gets more deeply into male supremacism and its intersections as a framework to work on, since this framework is pretty new as an intervention. The mentee program is a 12-month curriculum that gets a lot deeper into all kinds of different elements of male supremacist and other forms of supremacist ideologies. This month's preparatory readings for our mentee session include watching this recording. Our mentees will be preparing for our discussion session by looking at this recording and talking about a couple of really interesting articles. One by Chase Strangio, who's a trans activist and ACLU lawyer that just came out in the brand new Hammer and Hope magazine, which I super recommend reading for a little taste of the kind of stuff that we like to put into our programming. So we work across different kinds of issues. We work with the mentees on different versions of supremacism, understanding TERFs, understanding the appeals to men of color that are occurring in contemporary movements, thinking about things like dangerous speech and dehumanization that undergird supremacism, how we can understand those things, how conspiracy theories are wielded, how they grow and influence, how anti-feminist conspiracy theories have become really core to our current politics, and how much they borrow from the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have centuries of history behind them. And so these programs are ways for us to support researchers who are often really isolated in their institutions. They might be the only person doing anything like this work. And being able to provide ways for them to connect with each other, spaces like on our Slack channel to just let people know, hey, I'm getting a lot of online harassment right now, and I just kind of wanted to tell people who would understand what that looks like. We also provide digital security support and trainings, and for the first time, we're providing a training on legal threats in the upcoming month as a technique that is increasingly used by supremacists to attempt to silence researchers, and especially to silence researchers who are already vulnerable, such as women and researchers of color and trans and non-binary people. So we have a number of different programs that we encourage people to look at. Our first round deadline for the Anti-Supremacist Training Institute is coming up on March 1st. It's a really brief application. As I said, it's largely for us to learn about what the applicants are facing and be able to work that into our material. There will be other application deadlines on a rolling basis with different deadlines for funding support for different events if you're coming in person and things like that. So we really encourage looking at the call for applications around that and looking at our mentee and fellow calls as well. They go out in our emails and are on our website. And to think about if you are someone who is an organizer or a journalist or a researcher who wants a community and a network and a space where you can dig more into an intersectional feminist approach to rewriting supremacism and authoritarianism and working towards radical visions of social justice futures and democracy, then we super encourage looking at the work that we're doing. So thanks to those of you who stayed on with me, and to anyone who's watching the recording. For those who are on today, are there any questions that anyone wants to ask about our programming before we sign off for the evening?
I was just going to ask, are those links to the various applications and stuff, would that be included in the follow-up email?
Yeah, so when we send out our follow-up email with all the resources Chancey has been keeping track of, we'll also include the links to the calls for applications that are coming up. So if you didn't already see it, if you found this event like via Twitter or a share from someone else or something, you'll definitely get it in that follow-up email.
And if you're really like, you know, itching to look into it now, I dropped the information in the chat as well. The link is there. So if anyone, you know, wants to get started on the application, like Alex said, it's very brief, but if you want more information about the Institute, there is more information on that document that I shared. So yeah, and Alex just shared the website as well. So yeah, those are all things to look at and look into.
Is there anything else?
Questions, comments?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this first session. We are really excited about the year that we have ahead. Thanks again to Blue and Florence for joining us and presenting today. Thanks for Chancey, who's been with us a week and a half so far and is already doing really amazing work, and I've thrown them into everything. And we really hope that you continue to follow us, do more of our sessions, look out for our readings and be a part of our community. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.